Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Donald. We have with us Donald Rotherberg, who is a Dharma teacher and a writer, working with multiple organizations, including the Spirit Rock Meditation Center. Welcome to the call, Donald.
Yeah, good to be here. Yeah, hi.
Why don't you just start by telling people about your work, your work combining social justice and spiritual practice. Maybe an overview and how you came to be teaching that.
Yes, well, it's a very long story, and maybe I can best say that my aim is really to have an integrative form of spiritual practice that is appropriate for the needs of our times.
Mm.
And in terms of my own personal story, I came of age in the 60s and early 70s during the civil rights movement. My parents marched some with Dr. King and were very involved with issues. My mom for about 10 years did what would now be called diversity training or training, working with groups within the public school system in Richmond, Virginia, where they had moved to. And so, and So I was very socially active and pretty conscious as a teenager coming up, lot of important formative experiences. And similarly, when I went to college, it was fairly intense, a lot of participation in events, groups, demonstrations, and Washington, D.C., and so forth. I went to Yale University, which was very politically active. We actually, I think at the end of my sophomore year, we had a strike endorsed by the president in support of the Black Panthers, believe it or not.
Got it. I've met some of the New Haven Black Panthers, actually. So yeah,
Yeah,
I know that they
yeah,
were big. Yeah.
yeah. And so, but as I was in college, I also wanted to go more deeply, and I also started to notice that a lot of the people I was around who were more activists, there was problematic behavior. And, I spent a summer in France, 1970, I think, got a grant from the government to study French left-wing student activism, right? And so was And there and before, I was really questioning some of what I had seen in terms of people basically being self-righteous, not treating other people well. And, I would ask myself the question that I think Emma Goldman once asked a long time ago, the old anarchist, um, if I can't dance, do I want to be in this person's revolution? Like some version of that. And so there were questions developing. I also was looking more deeply and starting to study philosophy, become acquainted with mysticism, which was partly related to the use of psychedelics at that time. There was a lot of influences. And so it also took me, at the same time that I was socially, politically committed, also took me in looking more deeply on the spiritual quest. And shortly after that, to kind of be brief about it, I started meditating. I went out to Naropa Institute. I met Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and started doing insight meditation, started doing retreats, and was very taken by the going very deeply into deeper concentration, opening up to the energy body, just all the mysterious experiences that occur in meditation, the beauty of a calm mind, insight into my own psychology, all sorts of things. And yet I also knew that I was deeply committed to the social dimension and social transformation. So it became a question how do I bring these together? And that took a lot of different forms. Eventually, I moved to California and did a lot of work with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I was also at that time teaching at universities and graduate schools and doing quite a bit of scholarly writing on the integration of spirituality and social and political transformation, and doing writing on that, a number of essays. I became editor of a journal called Revision, which had originally been founded by Ken Wilber, and co-edited that and was the lead editor for 10 years, from 1990 to 2000. Also at that time, started to work very closely with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, developing training programs to bring together inner and outer work on spiritual practice and social transformation, and eventually did several other programs, training programs, one with Spirit Rock called The Path of Engagement. I did a 9-year long period doing an academic program called Socially Engaged Spirituality, which was more of an interfaith program. So we looked at indigenous traditions and Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist traditions, and looked deeply at the texts. And so that was all very, very formative. And some of the teaching and practice and work I did in groups eventually developed into a book called The Engaged Spiritual Life, which I published through Beacon Press, which was really a training manual for connecting inner and outer work. And since then, for me, there have been cycles where I've sometimes done more inner practices and sometimes been more emphasizing outer practices. And could talk more about that, but really the vision has been of an integrative practice, a spirituality suitable for our times that integrates spiritual practice, a lot of Western psychology. I have a background partly in psychology, and that's been a significant part of my work, as well as social service, social change, social justice work. So kind of a broad vision and how to do that, and increasingly how to do that with not a superficial spirituality, but also a deep spirituality. That's the vision. Still working on it.
Well, so there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I think the first thing I heard is that you grew up in the hippie generation and you took its messages seriously as far as social justice, anti-racism, Eastern spirituality, and you didn't put it to the side as you got older. It became, you deepened your commitment.
Yeah, it was at a certain point, it was very, very clear as I was in I remember in my late 20s, I had a really clear vision. My vision is to help develop a spirituality appropriate for our times. And that had to be integrative and have all these different dimensions. Some of which we continue to learn about. We see, for example, some of the shortcomings of the way that Western Buddhism has developed, and as well as the shortcomings of a lot of contemporary activism.
That was actually the next thing I was going to ask about is, well, I guess first, I hear that you saw right away you wanted to integrate the two, right?
Yeah.
They were being presented to you separately, but you were like, no, they can't stay separate, which for me, it took a lot longer than it sounds like it took you to see that they had to go together. What were some of the problematic, well, oh wait, you did say righteousness, and you said treating people poorly. Was that treating people poorly inside the movement or treating people poorly who were, adversaries or targets, or both?
Both, yeah. Yeah, I would say we can go down the list and they're all understandable from the perspective of Buddhist practice. It'd be dogmatism, self-righteousness, attachment to views, lack of empathy for people with other perspectives, as well as all of those aspects manifesting in our groups, as well as how often we would demonize the opponent.
And
And which I think also
what
is
were
connected with a certain lack of effectiveness. I once was invited to be part of a conference on spiritual activism organized by Tikkun magazine and Rabbi Michael Lerner. And I convened, I think my workshop was on what is the training that we need for spiritual activism. And I started by asking people, what are the issues in your groups or organizations? And they pretty much said, we don't treat each other well. We get angry with each other and we don't know how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
Pretty widespread. And yeah, so we can see that in the contemporary arena, can see it stretching back over many decades. And a lot of it comes from the lack of inner work and even attention to that.
So that's what I was about to ask, is how does bringing a spiritual practice help us avoid or deal with those pitfalls?
Well, there are many dimensions to it. There's the dimension of one's own inner practice, and there's also the question of how you bring spirituality into a relational and group context. Maybe I can deal with those separately because they each have contributions, but you need both. You can't just have the inner practice. You have to have the translation. How do you bring that into a relational setting, a group setting, into social action? So in terms of the first, just the benefits of spiritual practice, I think people can, especially when they're given guidance from a Buddhist perspective, although I think it'd be similar with other contemplative traditions. One of the things we're asked to look at in Buddhist practice is, where is their attachment? Where, just what are the patterns of my mind? Where does my mind go? Where am I attached to this view? And if we stay with our mind for a half an hour every morning, and then bring that in as much as we can into the rest of the day, it'll be very, very clear where there's attachment. One of the areas I teach on a lot is, I call it transforming the judgmental mind. And we can be mindful, where am I judgmental of myself, of my coworker, of my comrade, of my person I'm working with? And the tricky thing about the judgmental mind is that often we seek things clearly, but we go into reactivity, to use more Buddhist language. And so inner practice helps one, first of all, just to see what the patterns of the mind are, so they're not, as they more commonly are, on automatic and relatively unconscious. But we also find ways of working with them in an inner way. I learn how to work with my own judgmental mind. Distinguishing, again, what can be valid. I can be incredibly judgmental about injustice. And I'm seeing something really important and really clearly, and yet I get really judgmental about it, about my opponents, about others who don't see it like I do. And that can be very destructive, And so I learn how to preserve the insight and transform the reactivity, to use a formula that I use with the judgmental mind work.
Okay, so I think this is really interesting. You keep anticipating my questions, because what I was going to say is, what would you say to people who say, well, some things actually are immoral? If I become equanimity, if I reach equanimity about genocide and oppression, that's not a desired state.
Well, it depends what you mean by equanimity. In the Buddhist context, equanimity goes hand in hand with strong action. And if in my book on the engaged spiritual life, I actually had a whole chapter on equanimity. and I referenced some of the main spiritually grounded activists. Or if you think of maybe Dr. King, if you think of his speech actually in Memphis the day before he was assassinated, and he said, some of you may remember this, I don't care what happens to me. We have our direction, right? And there was a profound equanimity, meaning a balance with whatever came up, which goes hand in hand with strong response, strong action. So there can be misunderstandings even about that term, which I've seen a lot in my teaching. Maybe there's a better term to be used for that, but equanimity is more coming out of long experience, being able to be balanced even when you're angry, even when there's shock, and not have it take one into basically into reactivity, to be with difficult states, but then increasingly have them be workable. Yeah, but the larger point is that we're not asked to be, equanimity is often confused with calm and not doing anything. I think maybe that's what you're pointing to.
Or
And yeah, go ahead.
you were saying not judging, right? And I think people may hear not judging or a non-reactive state as pretending it either having no opinion or believing or acting like everything's okay.
That's right. There's also, right at the beginning, when I teach on transforming the judgmental mind, I point to the ambiguity in the English word judgment, which sometimes means just neutral discernment. The engineers had the judgment that the bridge would withstand that level of wind. Okay, that's sometimes called a judgment, but it also means being judgmental. And so I make the distinction between discernment and being judgmental. And we want discernment, we want seeing clearly. And again, in normal English, sometimes that's called a judgment. But being judgmental is a form of reactivity, which will be harmful, actually. Although it doesn't mean if you find yourself judgmental, you just, stand back. The point is to transform it. And sometimes you have to keep on acting, even though you're very judgmental. That's the best thing to do. So it's not a matter of if you're judgmental, don't act, but just to know that the basic Buddhist teaching is to transform reactivity.
Yeah, I think I just saw something.
Yeah.
So my ex-girlfriend was very much an activist for a while, and she used to talk about she didn't get angry often, and when she did, she would take important actions. And I realized, and so I was thinking, oh, there's this risk when we do things to regulate our nervous system that we get so calm that we don't feel driven, right, to take action. But I'm realizing that that's actually a crutch, to wait for our emotions and our automatic non-discerning reactions to be the only way we
That's
can
right.
act.
And it could be being attached to calm, because again, we're thinking that calm is everything because there's also in Buddhist practice, there's a threefold training in wisdom, meditation, and ethics. And you don't throw out, and ethics essentially means acting. Partly it means not harming and acting to prevent harm. And there's always the commitment to that. And you don't let an attachment to calm override ethics, which is a major problem in Western Buddhism. That there's so much focus on meditation, the ethical dimension has been somewhat marginalized. That's, I think, historically what's happened.
And there's a similar complaint about nonviolent communication, that there was always an ethical component, and many people took it on as a way to manage our own emotional experiences and not have unpleasant emotions.
Yeah, that's just a danger, maybe particularly for white middle class people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I absolutely got that. And I was going to, another thing I was going to ask you about is how you've brought, I know you've brought some Buddhist practices to combating racism. So tell us about how you've done
Oh, it's a long discussion.
that.
You
Okay.
know, as I mentioned, that's been part of my consciousness since I was pretty young.
Yeah.
Partly, I actually went to, elementary school, which was about 30 or 40% Black. So had young friend when I was young, had friends, which is probably not a typical experience for a person, racialized as white. Although, when I was growing up, being of Jewish background, I was sort of white with an asterisk. Not because I got a certain amount of anti-Semitism coming at me, and I knew I wasn't quite fitting in some ways. But like I said, it was an emphasis from my parents, particularly my mom, and so it's been an interest, over long periods of time, in terms of my studies, my reading, the dimension of socially engaged Buddhism. And I wanted to bring things together and developed a retreat in which I've given 3 times, and I've done also classes and day longs, which I call Buddhist Practice and Transforming Racism. And I want it to be also comprehensive. Again, there's been a certain amount of helpful application of Buddhist practice to working with racism. It's primarily been done through mindfulness, being mindful of one's own conditioning, which is very important as a component in the training that I give. But it's partial. Again, there's a way that the full training in wisdom teachings, meditation, and ethics in action is often not really presented. So I try to use that full model in terms of the retreat and the classes and the day longs. And so would have different components. This is in the context of maybe half, 2/3 of the time for the retreat, silent practice. But I looked into the wisdom teachings. How do you understand racism? Made a lot of use of history, particularly understanding the history of race and racism through a Buddhist lens, looking at greed, hatred, and delusion, and particularly through the history, seeing how racism from the beginning in the late 17th century was formed based on greed for wealth and power by the ruling elites, and the development of what's often called a divide and conquer strategy. Because prior to the end of the 17th century, we had people of African descent and mostly people of English descent working in the fields together. Like in Virginia, they were working together. There actually were no laws for slavery until 1661 there. They had the same lives, a high degree of intermarriage. According to scholars, no real animosity. And then there were rebellions against the rulers, particularly 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. And the rulers decided to do a divide and conquer strategy. They forbade intermarriage. They shifted away from having indentured servants and moved much more fully to slavery, which they then had laws for. And they blamed the rebellion completely on the people of African descent. A full divide and conquer strategy, which has been repeated over and over again right up to the present time. You can see it.
Yeah, I was about to say that division was so successful, it's lasted 350 years
Yeah, and
so
you can see
far.
it. You can see it explicitly. It was an explicit strategy from the Republican Party starting around 1962, 63. They had conferences where they
Yeah.
came up with the strategy that said, we will become the white man's party.
Hmm.
And 64 was the last presidential election in the US, in which the Democratic candidate had a majority of white people.
Yeah.
And so looking at greed, hatred, and delusion and seeing in some ways, contrary to how we usually think about it, racism is a product, and then it takes on a life of its own rather than coming out of people's animosity. That's really important to know, right? And so studying the history, looking at the wisdom dimensions, looking at the roots of greed and hatred and delusion, and then also doing meditative work, looking at our own conditioning. The retreats that I've done have all been with people racialized as white. So, there are complexities with bringing people of mixed backgrounds together, which I've done in some settings, but not in retreat settings, which I think was a good decision. And so we also, I do different prompts. We see some videos, and there are different ways of training to sort of bring up the conditioning and have people look at it over time. I should say that all of this is related to the earlier point I made about how do you bring meditative practice into groups. The first thing we did before we ever looked at any of this, we spent, I think, about 1 or maybe 2 sessions developing group guidelines. How can we look into a charged area together and have our time together be guided by wise speech, skillful communication, empathy, respect, compassion? And I think the first retreat we did on Buddhist practice and transforming racism, the group came up with 24 guidelines, which we would then repeat from time to time. They're a way of, when especially getting into charged areas, having agreements, which would permit us to treat each other well. Really, really crucial. And then we could, call out when people were getting into maybe being judgmental or very negative towards another's views. So we did that. And the last part of the retreat was more focused on action and ethical responses. What does each person feel called to do? And I pointed out a whole spectrum of possible actions. And then after the retreat, we met several times for follow-up, which was really important to see what was happening. So that's a short version of the retreat and training, but particularly bringing together those 3 areas in a group and community setting and doing a lot with history, really, really crucial.
It's very powerful, Donald. So we just have a couple minutes left. So
Okay.
I usually ask 2 questions, but I think I'm probably going to skip the one of them. Tell people about the free gift you're offering.
Oh, well, I'm a teacher at Spirit Rock. I do a lot of public talks. I've been doing them for 25 years or so and making them public. So there is a website called Dharma Seed where I have over 800 public talks and guided meditations on virtually all the core teachings, also on some of the themes we've mentioned, on socially engaged practice, several talks on Buddhist practice and transforming racism. And I give the link to access all the talks, which you can listen to online, you can download them, they're all available. And a very wide spectrum, all the core teachings, both more beginning and more advanced.
Great. And is there also a link for people to sign up to your email list if they want to stay
Yeah, if
in
you
your
want to
orbit?
stay in touch and be in contact, I don't send out too many emails, just a few a year, so you won't be bombarded. Although that's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, you can go to my website. I think we're making available a link
I'll make
through,
available a link for people to opt in. Yeah.
yeah, there's a link that you can go to sign up to stay in touch. Yeah, and there's also on my website, there's an email function to be directly in touch.
Great. Great. Well, Donald, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear about your work. It really feels like you pioneered something that I stumbled onto without knowing you. And now that now that I know about your work, I really see you as a role model. And just thank you for the difference you've been making for decades.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for your vision, Alice. And I've enjoyed this. The time went really, really quickly.
It did go very fast. And thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much.